Hello, I'm Michael Wybrow, and in this video I'm going to talk to you about media playback. So, audio content for our mobile devices now comes from a variety of different sources. A lot of it now is stored in the cloud, and that means phones don't need to store music and movies. They can just retrieve them from the web. People have a lot of data available, and they have good internet connections a lot of the places they go. So iOS supports most audio formats, including Apple's own audio codec, MP3, WAV, etc. And hardware decoding is available for certain formats like Apple's own ones, and you get some benefits there in terms of just they're optimized for Apple's devices. In terms of video, iOS has native support for playback and encoding of video content. So video playback does cause increased power use, and it is worth saying that some high resolution video can still be a problem, but only on older devices. All modern iOS devices have built-in hardware specifically for decoding video, and these particular video codecs that Apple are using now are the AVC, which is also known as H.264, and more recently this high efficiency video coding, which is HEVC, and that's also known as H.265. So you might see these if you were looking at software for like encoding videos, for example, to optimize them for iOS. Alright, so AV Foundation is a framework that gives us the ability to work with audio and video. So AV is audio video. This framework gives a low-level interface for managing and playing audio and other visual resources. Visual resources. So there's classes for audio, video, and also working with the cameras. One such class is AV Audio Player. And this gives us playback of audio tracks, either from a file or from data in memory. And you can also do sound looping, volume control, etc. And once a player is set up, we can call playback methods. So there's play, pause, and stop. Be aware, the stop method here is maybe not what you expect. It actually frees memory associated with the player, like the memory it's using for caching content, but it doesn't affect the play position. So just be aware of that. If you want to set this back to the beginning, you have to tell it to go back to the beginning, set its position back to the beginning. So how do we work with AV Audio Player? Here's an example of getting an MP3 file from the internet and playing it. So we need an instance of Audio Player, which is AV Audio Player here. And then when our view loads, there's no interface for any of this. We're just, as soon as the view controller loads, we're just playing some audio. We're first going to get the URL. This is just a podcast episode that I put in here. This looks the same as when we saw our web services. We are downloading from this URL and just getting the data and loading it into memory. We check the HTTP response just to make sure that it worked okay. Assuming it did, we have a data object then, and we can instantiate AV Audio Player and pass it some data. This can throw, so we do it inside a do catch block. And once we've got this, we can tell it to play. And after a moment or two, it will download this. When it's finished downloading it, it'll load the data into AV Player and you'll hear it play. So there are some alternatives if you're just looking for music playback. We have Media Player and also Music Kit. So Media Player is a collection of inbuilt libraries that can play things from the user's music library. Example of this is MP Music Player Controller. And this is usually quick integration of media into your application, but you don't have as much control as you do with the lower level frameworks. Obviously, if you're accessing the user's media library, you can't just do that without needing permissions. So same as last week with the location services, we need to add the relevant permission to our info plist. So it's the same as what we did last week. A media player, is used. Media player is not used for video media. And then Music Kit is a way of working with Apple Music, which is Apple's kind of own subscription service, a bit like Spotify. And you can use that for playback of Apple Music within your application. So if you want to look at that, you can find more information on Music Kit here. Alright, so AV Player, we were looking at AV Audio Player before, but AV Player is a more general player that works with both audio and video. So this is low level. It allows playback either from a file or from a network stream. You can choose exactly how we display an interface for it. So we can completely write our own interface if you wanted to for, say, your own podcast app. And you can also use it to work with AirPlay-enabled devices to stream audio and video to them, like an Apple TV or an Airport Express device. And AV Player allows a single file to be played. However, you can replace the current item with this method, replace current item with something. There's also a player queue if you want multiple media files to be played. So like if you want a playlist of one song after another, for example. There's also an accompanying class called AV Player View Controller, and this is Apple's own interface for AV Player if you don't want to write your own. And it provides a playback view and controls that match the system ones. It has support for AirPlay, it has support for full screen playback, it provides a slider to scrub to a particular position. One downside is it just shows a black empty video if you're just displaying audio content. So, I mean, it's really a video playback interface more than anything. So how do we work with AV Player? Well, I've got an example here. The core of it is that we need an AV Player instance, and to load that, let me just skip ahead one slide. To load that, here we got an instance of it. And when we've got our instance of AV Player, we can just tell it to replace the current item and we have to give not just a URL but an AV Player item, which we can instantiate using a URL, and then we can tell it to play. In this case, I've done this using a download task. So the idea here is I would download a video file, and when it's finished, I could save it somewhere so that I have it for next time and I don't have to re-download it each time. In this case, I've chosen to do it using delegation. So you'll see I set up a new URL session configuration, and I set myself up as a delegate for it, and then that's called session, and we use that session to do a download task that we do inside a task block, as we've seen before. This is async code, and when it's finished, we're not doing anything other than ending the task block. But because we've got this delegate relationship, which is ourself, and we've got URL session task delegate and URL session download delegate, we can write our own delegate method, which is this one, URL session download task did finish downloading to, and we get a URL where it downloaded to. Now this URL, which incidentally, if you wanted to write this all just as async code without the delegate, download this download method, if you look at the documentation, returns a tuple of two things. The first is the URL it downloaded to, and the second is the response, a bit like our data task that returns the data and the response. So you could just get the URL it downloaded to there and then do the same thing we're going to show on this next slide. But we're doing it through the delegate callback here. So we get the URL. This is a temporary file, so it's like a cache file. It exists right now, but the next time you load the app, the file might not be there anymore. So if you want it to persist, you need to store it to a permanent location. That's kind of what we're doing here. We're going to load the data from this file at the temporary location. The next 3 lines are what we've seen before. It's us getting a file inside the user's documents directory. So we get the documents directory for the user, and this is an array, but we get the first element, and we append to it movie.mp4. So this will be a file called movie.mp4 living in the user's document directory, which is unique to the app. And that's a URL. Next, we take that data and we write it to the file URL. And there's some code in here that can throw, like data write or data here. So we're doing all this inside a do catch block. Once we've written it to a permanent position, we can tell the player to replace the current item, and we give it that file URL. So yeah, there's an example of using AV Player and also AV Player View Controller. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll go into more detail on these in our workshop examples. And if you have any questions, bring them along to the workshop. Thank you.